The frost along Route 33 cracked under a deputy's boot as headlights cut through pre-dawn fog, revealing a purse half buried in frozen leaves, a single shoe nearby, and tire impressions fading toward a tree line, the silence heavy with the knowledge that whatever waited beyond the ditch would change the county forever. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on December 6, 2002, just outside the town of Gordonsville, Virginia, where the Piedmont Hills flatten into farmland and two-lane roads knit together quiet neighborhoods, churches, and diners that serve coffee before dawn. The item recovered first was a brown leather purse, scuffed, the strap torn, its contents scattered by wind and time rather than violence. Inside were receipts dated Thanksgiving weekend, a library card, and a driver's license identifying 22-year-old Emily R. Harlan. The deputy noted the temperature, the thin crust of ice, and the absence of fresh footprints beyond his own. The scene felt staged by weather more than by a hand, but the implication was immediate. Emily Harlan had been reported missing 3 days earlier by her mother after failing to return to her apartment in Charlottesville following a holiday visit home. Emily was a senior at the University of Virginia, studying environmental science, known for her steady habits and careful planning. She worked part-time at a campus bookstore, called her parents regularly, and had driven home for Thanksgiving on November 28. She left Gordonsville the following Sunday afternoon, intending to be back before nightfall. Her car never arrived. When she missed a Monday shift and did not answer her phone, her mother contacted local police. The missing person report was logged with a time stamp that would later anchor the entire investigation. Flyers went up on corkboards and storefront windows. Local radio read her description between weather updates predicting early snow. By the time the purse was found, the search had already been widened to include Albemarle County and neighboring Orange County. Virginia State Police joined the effort, bringing dogs trained for tracking in cold conditions. The terrain where the purse lay was a shallow roadside ditch leading to mixed woods, oaks stripped bare, undergrowth flattened by winter. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no obvious trail. The dogs worked in widening arcs, their handlers careful to mark every point of interest with flags that fluttered against the gray sky. The trail went cold near a gravel pull-off used by hunters during deer season, now quiet after Thanksgiving. Emily's car, a blue 1998 Honda Civic, was located later that afternoon in a commuter lot near the Charlottesville bypass. It had been parked neatly between lines, doors locked, no damage visible. The odometer reading suggested the car had not traveled beyond her normal route. Inside, investigators found nothing out of place. The gas tank was half full. The radio presets were unchanged. There were no signs of a breakdown or accident. The car's presence in a public lot shifted the theory away from mechanical failure and toward human intervention, but it provided no suspect. Winter settled in quickly that year. December nights dipped into the teens, and the search expanded before snow could erase subtle indicators. Helicopters flew grid patterns over fields and wooded parcels, their downwash stirring leaves but revealing nothing. Volunteers from local fire departments walked shoulder to shoulder, orange vests bright against muted land. Each day ended with briefings in a municipal building where maps were taped to walls and notes were updated in careful handwriting. Emily's parents attended when they could, listening without interruption, absorbing procedure as if it were language. The autopsy would come later. For now, the focus remained on finding her. On December 12, a hunter checking trail cameras discovered a body in a wooded ravine 2 miles from where the purse had been found. The location was not remote but hidden by terrain, a place where sound traveled poorly and sightlines were broken by slope. The body was partially concealed by leaves and branches, positioned as if placed rather than dropped. There was no evidence of predation, suggesting death had occurred elsewhere or shortly before placement. The medical examiner was notified, and the area was secured under protocol, every step logged, every photograph numbered. Emily Harlan was identified through dental records later that day. She was 22 years old. The preliminary findings indicated exposure and blunt force trauma consistent with a fall or impact, but without clear cause pending further analysis. There were no defensive wounds. Toxicology would take weeks. The time of death was estimated between the evening of November 30 and the early hours of December 1, aligning with the last confirmed contact, a brief call to her roommate made while driving. Cell phone records showed the call dropped near Gordonsville, an anomaly given the coverage along that route. The community response was immediate and restrained. A vigil was held on the courthouse lawn, candles flickering against cold wind, the local paper running a front-page photograph of Emily smiling in a scarf. There were no rumors printed, only facts confirmed by police. Editors understood the weight of words in a town where names were familiar. Christmas decorations went up anyway, wreaths on doors, lights on porches, a contrast that felt uneasy but necessary. The case was now a homicide investigation by statute, though the manner was not yet publicly declared. Detectives reconstructed Emily's final day minute by minute. They interviewed gas station clerks along her route, reviewed security footage from stores she might have passed, and pulled toll records even though the road was not tolled, checking adjacent highways for anomalies. Witnesses reported a blue Honda seen pulled over near the ditch that Sunday afternoon, hazard lights flashing briefly, then off. One motorist recalled a dark pickup truck parked behind it, no plates noticed. The description was vague, the memory softened by time and traffic, but it was logged and compared against vehicle registrations. The investigation leaned heavily on procedure. Phone records were subpoenaed. Credit card activity was traced and found to stop with a coffee purchase near Gordonsville earlier that day. Her bank account showed no unusual withdrawals. Friends were interviewed, then re-interviewed, their statements consistent. There was no evidence of a troubled relationship or secret plans. Emily's routine life narrowed the field rather than expanding it. The absence of chaos was itself a clue. As December moved toward Christmas, the case slowed outwardly and intensified inwardly. Detectives compiled binders of reports, photographs, and timelines. The medical examiner's final report confirmed blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia as contributing factors, with the manner of death classified as homicide. The injuries suggested an assault followed by abandonment in cold conditions. There was no indication of sexual assault. Fibers recovered from Emily's clothing were cataloged, some consistent with automotive upholstery not matching her own car. Soil samples from her shoes were compared to locations along the route, narrowing potential sites of initial contact. Christmas Eve came with freezing rain. Officers worked shortened shifts, but the case did not rest. Leads were followed quietly. A man with a prior record for roadside scams was questioned and released. Another tip pointed to a transient camp miles away, investigated and cleared. The absence of an obvious suspect weighed heavily, but the evidence was preserved with care, sealed in envelopes labeled in block letters, stored in climate-controlled lockers. The cold would not erase what was properly kept. By New Year's Day, 2003, the case was formally designated a cold case within the department's system, not abandoned but awaiting new information. The label carried weight but also discipline. Annual reviews were scheduled. Media attention receded, replaced by brief mentions on anniversaries. Emily's parents returned to their routines, marked by absence. The town moved forward, roads cleared of salt. winter turning slowly toward spring, while the file bearing Emily Harlan's name rested among others, waiting for the one detail that would connect all the quiet pieces. The designation as a cold case did not halt activity so much as reorganize it into intervals governed by patience and record keeping. Detectives rotated, but the binders remained, thick with index pages, each report cross-referenced to dates and locations. In early 2003, a senior investigator conducted the first comprehensive review, reading from the beginning to the end without interruption, noting what had not been pursued aggressively during the initial surge. The focus returned to the moment Emily Harlan's phone call dropped near Gordonsville and the brief sighting of a dark pickup truck near the roadside. Those two facts, unremarkable alone, began to shape renewed inquiry. Cellular coverage maps from 2002 were obtained from the carrier, showing dead zones and handoff points along Route 33. Engineers explained how a dropped call could occur if a phone moved abruptly or if power was interrupted. The time stamp placed Emily within a narrow corridor. Investigators canvassed that stretch again, this time with updated aerial imagery and land records. They identified properties with access points obscured from the road, places where a vehicle could pull off without drawing attention. One such property belonged to a small towing and auto repair business that had changed ownership shortly after Emily's death. The business, located less than a mile from where the purse was found, had operated under the name Piedmont Recovery. Records showed that in late 2002 it employed 3 men, all with access to flatbed trucks and roadside equipment. The company frequently assisted stranded motorists, sometimes flagged down informally. That detail had been noted early but not pursued due to lack of evidence. Now, with time and distance, investigators returned to it with methodical restraint. Employment records were subpoenaed. One employee, 34-year-old Mark D. Ellison, stood out due to a prior arrest for assault in another county, charges later reduced. Ellison's background revealed a pattern of short-term employment and residences clustered around Central Virginia. He owned a dark green pickup truck registered under a relative's name during 2002. The truck had been sold in early 2003, title transferred without inspection records retained. Investigators requested maintenance logs from the towing company and found entries indicating interior upholstery replacement on a vehicle matching the truck's description in January 2003. The timing aligned uncomfortably with the investigation's early phase. A request for a voluntary interview was made. Ellison agreed and appeared at the station without counsel, speaking in measured terms. He denied any involvement and stated he had been off duty on the Sunday Emily disappeared. His account placed him at home watching football, a claim partially supported by a roommate who could not recall specific times. The interview was recorded, transcribed, and set aside. At that moment, there was no probable cause, only coincidence and timing. Years passed. The case file was reviewed annually, each time with incremental additions. Advances in forensic science prompted re-examination of preserved evidence. In 2008, fibers recovered from Emily's clothing were reanalyzed using improved microscopy. The results indicated a synthetic blend consistent with automotive seat fabric used in late 1990s pickup trucks. While not exclusive, the finding narrowed possibilities. Soil samples were compared against expanded databases, suggesting the primary contact site was not the ravine where the body was found, but an area closer to the road with gravel composition, matching commercial lots rather than forest floor. The community aged alongside the case. New businesses opened and closed. The towing company was long gone. Emily's parents attended memorial walks quietly, their presence steady. Local press marked the 10th anniversary with a single column summarizing facts, careful not to speculate. Behind the scenes, a state police cold case unit adopted the file in 2013, bringing fresh eyes and resources. They digitized records, scanned photographs, and mapped timelines using software unavailable in 2002. A break came from an unexpected direction. In 2016, a man arrested in North Carolina for an unrelated assault mentioned during booking that he had once worked at a Virginia towing company and knew of a case involving a young woman found in the woods. The statement was flagged by an officer familiar with interstate databases. The man was not Ellison, but a former coworker, now estranged. He claimed Ellison had confided years earlier about a girl who wouldn't get back in her car. The remark was vague and second-hand, but it was documented under oath. Investigators returned to Ellison, now living in a neighboring state, employed as a warehouse supervisor. This time, the interview was conducted with a warrant authorizing collection of DNA. Ellison complied. The sample was compared against trace evidence preserved from Emily's clothing, including skin cells recovered from the interior fibers. The results were not immediate. The lab process took months, complicated by degradation due to age. When the report arrived, it indicated a partial match consistent with Ellison's profile, with a probability ratio high enough to warrant further action. Simultaneously, phone records long thought exhausted were revisited through newer analytical methods. While content was unavailable, tower connection logs revealed that Ellison's phone had been active near Gordonsville on the afternoon Emily disappeared, contradicting his earlier claim of being home. The discrepancy was documented. Investigators sought corroboration through credit card receipts and found a fuel purchase made with Ellison's card at a station along Route 33 within the relevant time window. Surveillance footage was no longer available, but the receipt placed him geographically. The case advanced carefully. A grand jury was convened in 2019 to review evidence. Witnesses testified in sequence, including the former coworker, forensic analysts, and investigators who reconstructed the timeline. The narrative presented was restrained and factual. Emily's car likely experienced a minor issue or was perceived as such by Ellison, who stopped under the pretense of assistance. The interaction escalated. Emily was struck, incapacitated, and transported briefly before being abandoned in the ravine. Her car was later moved and parked to obscure the trail. An arrest warrant was issued in February 2020. Ellison was taken into custody without incident at his workplace. The news reached Gordonsville quietly, reported first by a regional paper with a headline that avoided triumph. The charge was second-degree murder. Ellison pleaded not guilty. Pretrial motions addressed the admissibility of decades-old evidence. The court ruled that preservation protocols had been followed adequately, allowing forensic results to stand. The trial began in early December, nearly 18 years after Emily's death. Proceedings were methodical. Jurors were presented with timelines, maps, and expert testimony. The defense challenged the reliability of partial DNA matches and circumstantial placement. The prosecution emphasized convergence rather than any single element. Whether records were introduced to explain exposure, maintenance logs and employment schedules were entered into evidence. There was no reliance on emotion, only accumulation. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Ellison was sentenced to 30 years in state prison, eligible for parole under statutes in effect at the time of the crime. Emily's parents attended the sentencing, seated together, their expressions composed. There was no statement read aloud, only presence. Outside the courthouse, winter had returned, light snow beginning to fall on familiar steps. The aftermath was quiet. The case file was closed formally, stamped and archived. A plaque was placed near the university in Emily's name, funded by a scholarship endowment. The town absorbed the conclusion without celebration. Roads were salted again. Christmas lights reflected on wet pavement. For those who had carried the weight of the unknown, resolution arrived not as relief but as a settled fact, recorded, lawful and complete, the long arc of procedure finally meeting its end. In the years between Emily Harlan's disappearance and the eventual arrest, the case existed in a kind of suspended state familiar to many investigators and to families who wait through long winters of uncertainty. Each December brought renewed attention, not through headlines but through quiet administrative actions. Evidence boxes were checked for seal integrity. Chain of custody forms were reviewed and re-signed. The passage of time itself became an evidentiary concern, demanding that every decision made in 2002 could still withstand scrutiny decades later. This vigilance would later prove decisive. The cold case unit's involvement reshaped how the investigation was understood internally. Rather than searching for new witnesses who might remember more, analysts focused on reinterpreting what had already been collected. The early interviews were replayed and transcribed again, not for content alone but for omissions. Ellison's 2003 interview drew attention because of its specificity in some areas and vagueness in others. He remembered what game he claimed to watch but not the score. He recalled being home but could not describe the sequence of the afternoon. These details, insignificant at first, were marked for later comparison. Weather data from late November 2002 was compiled from the National Weather Service archives. The Sunday Emily vanished was cold but clear, with sunset shortly after 5 in the evening. Temperatures dropped quickly after dusk. This mattered because it framed the narrow window in which hypothermia could contribute to death. The medical examiner's estimate, once broad, could now be refined. Investigators concluded Emily likely died within hours of her disappearance, strengthening the argument that the person who encountered her that afternoon bore direct responsibility. Attention also returned to the movement of Emily's vehicle. Parking enforcement logs from the commuter lot showed no citations for the Honda Civic during the days following November 30, indicating it had been parked legally and deliberately. Snow had fallen lightly midweek, and photographs taken later showed no accumulation on the car's windshield, suggesting it had been moved or wiped. This supported the theory that the vehicle was repositioned after Emily's death, an act requiring time, familiarity with the area, and confidence that it would not be noticed. The forensic review expanded to include trace materials once thought too degraded. Advances in touch DNA analysis allowed technicians to extract profiles from areas previously dismissed, including the torn purse strap. The resulting partial profile did not exclude Ellison. While not definitive on its own, it added another layer of consistency. Prosecutors understood that juries weigh patterns as much as absolutes, especially in cases built over time. Investigators also examined Ellison's behavior after 2002. Employment records showed abrupt departures from jobs, often following conflicts. In one instance, a supervisor noted an unexplained absence during a police inquiry unrelated to Emily's case. Friends and former partners described volatility but no specific confessions. Importantly, none of this was presented as character evidence initially. It served instead to test whether Ellison's life trajectory aligned with someone carrying an unresolved crime. The pattern was not unusual, but it was not reassuring. The legal groundwork required equal care. Prosecutors consulted with experts in cold case litigation, reviewing precedents where convictions relied on circumstantial convergence. They prepared to explain why delays occurred without implying negligence. The narrative would emphasize preservation, restraint, and eventual technological progress. Every exhibit was tested for admissibility. Defense motions sought to suppress DNA findings and challenge the reliability of decades-old memories. Judges ruled narrowly, focusing on process rather than outcome. As the trial approached, the town of Gordonsville was changed but recognizable. The same courthouse stood, its steps worn smooth. Local reporters who had covered the original search were retired or nearing retirement, replaced by younger journalists who learned the case history from archives. Their coverage adopted a measured tone, reflecting both journalistic standards and community fatigue with speculation. There were no crowds outside the courthouse, only a few cameras and familiar faces. During the trial, the prosecution's timeline unfolded methodically. Jurors heard about Emily's Thanksgiving visit, her return drive, the dropped call, and the sighting near Route 33. They saw maps showing distances measured in minutes rather than miles. Experts explained how towing trucks operated, how assistance could be offered convincingly, and how quickly a situation could turn. The absence of eyewitnesses was acknowledged openly, framed as a reality of rural roads and fading daylight. The defense countered by questioning assumptions. They suggested alternative explanations for fiber transfer and cell phone location data. They argued that coincidence had been elevated to certainty, yet they could not account for the convergence of location, timing, vehicle description, and forensic links. The jury was instructed carefully on reasonable doubt, reminded that the burden rested entirely with the state. When deliberations began, winter weather again brushed central Virginia. Jurors spent hours reviewing exhibits, requesting readbacks of technical testimony. They returned with questions focused on sequence rather than motive. The eventual verdict reflected acceptance of a reconstructed truth rather than absolute clarity. The law does not require certainty beyond all doubt, only beyond reasonable doubt, and the evidence met that threshold. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines. The judge spoke briefly, noting the length of time the case had remained unresolved and the impact of delayed justice. Ellison was given credit for time served and informed of parole eligibility under the law as it stood in 2002. There was no outburst, no visible reaction. The process concluded as it had proceeded, without spectacle. For Emily Harlan's family, closure arrived in a muted form. They released a statement thanking investigators for persistence and restraint. They did not call for harsher punishment or broader reform. Their focus remained on Emily's life rather than the manner of her death. A scholarship fund in her name grew slowly, supporting students who shared her interests. Each award announcement was accompanied by a brief reminder of why it existed. The case's resolution prompted internal reviews within law enforcement agencies. Training materials were updated to emphasize early preservation of seemingly minor evidence. The importance of revisiting interviews with fresh perspective was reinforced. The Gordonsville case became a reference point, cited quietly in seminars rather than public forums. Its lessons were practical rather than dramatic. As years continued to pass, the story settled into the community's collective memory. It was no longer an open wound but a scar, visible when touched. Roads where searches once took place were driven daily without notice. The ravine where Emily was found returned to its natural state, leaves falling and gathering each autumn. The land did not mark the event, but records did. In the end, the case demonstrated how time alters investigations without erasing responsibility. Evidence waited. Records endured. Technology advanced. Human patience, both professional and personal, carried the matter forward. Emily Harlan's death was not undone, but it was accounted for, documented, and judged according to law. In a system built on procedure rather than speed, that accounting stands as the final measure of justice, delivered quietly, long after the first winter passed. The resolution of the case did not mark an end to its influence. Within weeks of the verdict, law enforcement agencies across Virginia requested access to the investigative summary, not for public release but for internal study. The Emily Harlan case illustrated how a disappearance initially framed by uncertainty could be rebuilt patiently through records, restraint, and evolving science. For seasoned investigators approaching retirement, it reaffirmed principles learned decades earlier. That time can obscure memory but sharpen documentation if preserved correctly. One of the most scrutinized aspects after conviction was the initial roadside interaction. Investigators revisited early assumptions and recognized how ordinary circumstances often conceal critical events. Emily's situation likely began without alarm. A stopped car on a rural road in daylight did not trigger immediate concern. Offers of assistance from individuals associated with towing or mechanical work carried an air of legitimacy. This understanding informed later training, emphasizing that crimes often emerge from familiar contexts rather than overt threats. The handling of Emily's vehicle became a case study in delayed significance. At the time it was located, the car appeared unremarkable. Only years later did subtle indicators, parking duration, weather exposure, and absence of citations, reveal intent. Analysts demonstrated how small administrative records, when layered together, can reconstruct human decisions. The commuter lot, once just a location, became a silent witness through paperwork and routine enforcement logs. Attention also turned to the role of the community. Gordonsville's response was notable for its restraint. There were no vigilante impulses, no public accusations that forced investigators to divert resources. Tips were submitted through proper channels, many of them inconclusive, but the steady cooperation allowed detectives to proceed without pressure to act prematurely. In interviews conducted after the trial, officers credited this atmosphere with preventing investigative missteps. The media's role was similarly measured. Early reporting avoided speculation, focusing instead on confirmed facts. Editors resisted the temptation to frame the case as a mystery beyond resolution. This discipline preserved the integrity of public perception, ensuring that when an arrest finally occurred, it was received as the outcome of evidence rather than rumor. Journalism students later examined the coverage as an example of ethical reporting in prolonged investigations. Forensic professionals involved in the case reflected on the importance of preservation over immediacy. Evidence collected in 2002 was processed according to standards of the time, yet sealed and stored with future analysis in mind. Technicians acknowledged that they could not have predicted later advancements, but adherence to protocol made those advancements usable. The case reinforced a central lesson of forensic work, that careful handling today enables answers tomorrow. Within the judicial system, the case prompted discussion about statutes of limitation and evidentiary thresholds. Prosecutors emphasized that homicide investigations do not expire, but their success depends on sustained commitment. Judges referenced the trial in opinions addressing cold case evidence, noting that age alone does not diminish probative value if integrity is maintained. These citations entered legal databases quietly, influencing decisions beyond the county. Emily Harlan's name gradually transitioned from a missing person poster to a legal precedent within certain circles. For her family, this transformation was complex. They attended none of the professional conferences where the case was discussed. Their engagement remained personal, centered on remembrance rather than instruction. Each December, they visited Gordonsville briefly, walking familiar streets, acknowledging the passage of time without public ceremony. The scholarship established in Emily's honor became a point of continuity. Recipients often learned of its origin through a brief paragraph, enough to convey purpose without dwelling on tragedy. Some wrote letters of thanks, describing research projects or career plans. These letters were kept by the family, tangible evidence that Emily's life continued to influence others in practical ways. The fund's growth was steady, reflecting community support expressed without fanfare. From an investigative standpoint, one of the enduring lessons involved the reassessment of early interviews. Analysts demonstrated how initial statements, even when truthful, can later reveal inconsistencies when placed alongside new data. Ellison's first interview, once seen as unremarkable, gained weight through contrast rather than content. This insight informed new interview training, encouraging detailed documentation even when no immediate suspicion exists. The case also highlighted the value of interagency cooperation. State police, local departments, and federal databases each contributed elements that no single entity could assemble alone. The exchange of information across jurisdictions, particularly years after the fact, required persistence and professional respect. The successful coordination became an internal benchmark, cited in evaluations of later cold case efforts. As time moved forward, the physical locations associated with the case continued their ordinary existence. Route 33 carried commuters and holiday travelers. The ravine filled with leaves each autumn and cleared with spring rain. The commuter lot expanded slightly, adding new lighting. None of these places bore markers, and most passers-by were unaware of their history. This quiet return to normalcy underscored the difference between lived experience and recorded memory. For those who worked the case from start to finish, retirement arrived with mixed reflection. Some investigators spoke privately of relief that the file did not remain open at the end of their careers. Others noted that the resolution reaffirmed their belief in process over instinct. The case became part of their professional identity, a reminder that patience and documentation can eventually converge into clarity. The legal aftermath concluded with appeals that were considered and denied. Appellate courts found no procedural errors sufficient to overturn the verdict. The conviction stood, and the sentence remained in effect. With those rulings, the legal system completed its role. The case transitioned fully into history, recorded in files, databases, and memories. Each Thanksgiving and Christmas that followed carried quieter significance for those connected to the case. Seasonal markers that once framed uncertainty now marked endurance. The cold that had preserved evidence and delayed discovery became symbolic of the long interval between loss and accountability. Yet it also underscored the environment in which the truth endured, waiting to be assembled. In reviewing the case years later, analysts often return to a simple observation. Nothing about Emily Harlan's life suggested risk. Her routines were ordinary, her plans clear. The crime emerged not from chaos, but from a momentary intersection with the wrong individual. This understanding shaped preventative outreach, reminding communities that vulnerability can exist even in familiar settings. Ultimately, the Virginia 2002 cold case resolved not through a single revelation but through accumulation. Each record, sample, and recollection contributed incrementally. The outcome was lawful, verifiable, and restrained. It did not restore what was lost, but it affirmed the capacity of a system built on persistence to deliver answers, even after many winters passed. The final chapter of the Emily Harlan case unfolded not with public ceremony but with administrative certainty, the kind that defines true resolution rather than spectacle. Once appeals were exhausted and the conviction affirmed, the case status in state and federal databases was formally updated from active to resolved. That change triggered a cascade of routine actions, archiving procedures, long-term evidence storage decisions, and final summaries prepared for internal reference. The work was quiet, meticulous, and definitive. Within the Virginia State Police, the case file became part of institutional memory. New investigators were assigned portions of it during training, not as an example of dramatic policing, but as a study in restraint. The emphasis was placed on what was not done as much as what was. No rushed arrests, no public accusations, no reliance on confessions. The case demonstrated that adherence to method could withstand time, legal challenge, and scrutiny from every direction. The original investigators, some now retired, were contacted for final statements to be included in the archive. Their reflections were factual rather than emotional. They noted missed opportunities, acknowledged limits of early technology, and emphasized the importance of revisiting assumptions. None claimed foresight. All credited documentation. Their accounts reinforced a central truth of long-term investigations, that certainty is rarely immediate, but accuracy can be preserved. Emily Harlan's autopsy report, once a provisional document, became final in context. The findings were no longer isolated medical facts, but components of a completed narrative. The blunt force trauma, the exposure, and the estimated time of death aligned with the reconstructed sequence of events presented at trial. In professional circles, the report was cited as an example of cautious language that allowed later reinterpretation without contradiction. Precision had mattered. The suspect's imprisonment followed standard procedure. Intake assessments were completed. Classification decisions were made based on the nature of the offense and the absence of prior homicide convictions. There were no public statements issued. The correctional system absorbed the individual as it does countless others, with no reference to the years of uncertainty that preceded the sentence. The system moved forward as designed. For Emily's family, the conclusion of legal proceedings marked a boundary rather than an end. They no longer awaited phone calls from investigators or tracked court dates. Their engagement with the justice system concluded not with relief but with acceptance. In private correspondence, they expressed appreciation for the thoroughness of the process rather than the outcome itself. Their focus remained on remembrance, not retribution. The town of Gordonsville continued its rhythms unchanged. Seasonal events returned each year. Holiday parades passed along streets that had once hosted search volunteers. The courthouse steps were used for routine matters, property disputes, traffic cases, and civic announcements. The Emily Harlan case was not forgotten, but it no longer defined local identity. It existed as a chapter, not a headline. Local law enforcement agencies updated protocols influenced by the case. Roadside assistance reports were refined. Voluntary interaction guidelines were clarified. Officers were encouraged to document even benign encounters involving stranded motorists. These changes were incremental, grounded in practicality rather than fear. The goal was awareness, not alarm. Academic institutions also took note. Criminal justice programs referenced the case when discussing cold case methodology. Students examined timelines, evidence preservation, and the ethical challenges of delayed prosecution. The absence of sensational elements made the case particularly instructive. It showed how ordinary environments can yield extraordinary consequences without abandoning realism. Over time, public interest shifted from the mystery of the crime to the mechanics of its resolution. Articles written years later focused on process rather than tragedy. The narrative evolved from what happened to how it was proven. This shift reflected maturity in public discourse, an understanding that justice is measured by integrity rather than immediacy. Emily's scholarship fund continued quietly. Annual disbursements supported research, fieldwork, and graduate study. Recipients were not asked to represent a legacy, only to pursue knowledge. In this way, Emily's name remained associated with growth rather than loss. The fund became a living element of her story, grounded in progress. The physical evidence associated with the case was preserved according to long-term standards. Items unlikely to be re-examined were retained under controlled conditions. Digital records were backed up redundantly. The chain of custody documentation was finalized. These actions ensured that the case could withstand future review, even though none was anticipated. Finality did not mean neglect. As decades passed, the case joined a small category within law enforcement culture, those resolved after long dormancy through cumulative effort rather than dramatic breakthroughs. It was referenced quietly, respected rather than celebrated. Investigators understood that not every case would follow the same path, but the principles remained transferable. The seasonal context that framed the original crime continued to shape its memory. Thanksgiving marked the beginning of the timeline. Christmas symbolized the waiting. Winter represented preservation, both literal and procedural. These associations were not imposed by narrative design, but emerged naturally from circumstance. They remained embedded in how the case was recalled. For the generation of residents who remembered the original search, the resolution brought a subdued sense of completion. There were no gatherings, no public statements. Conversations acknowledged the outcome briefly before moving on. This restraint reflected the community's character, steady, private, and pragmatic. In the end, the Virginia 2002 cold case stood as a testament to measured persistence. A young woman's life was lost under ordinary circumstances that concealed extraordinary harm. The response was not immediate clarity but sustained attention. Records endured, evidence waited, technology advanced, human judgment matured. The system did not act quickly, but it acted correctly. The conclusion was lawful, verifiable, and final. Emily Harlan's name was no longer attached to uncertainty. It was attached to a resolved record, a complete file, and a quiet acknowledgement that justice, though delayed, had been carried through to its proper end.